On February 22, 2019, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Kei Matsuda, the invited speaker for the 2019 Apple Lecture Series hosted by the Applied Linguistics and TESOL program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Matsuda is Professor of English and Director of Second Language Writing at Arizona State University, where he works closely with doctoral students specializing in second language writing from various disciplinary perspectives. He is also Concurrent Professor of Applied Linguistics at Nanjing University and Zhengzhou University. Dr. Matsuda is founding chair of the Symposium on Second Language Writing and series editor of the Parlor Press Series on Second Language Writing. Former president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics, he has also served as the founding chair of the CCCC Committee on Second Language Writing and the chair of the Nonnative English Speakers in TESOL Caucus. He has published widely on various topics on language, writing, and professional development in applied linguistics, rhetoric and composition in TESOL, and has received a number of prestigious awards for his publications. He has been invited to present keynote and plenary talks as well as lectures and workshops in more than 27 countries. We'd like to thank Dr. Matsuda for taking the time to do this interview, and we are very excited to hear his thoughts on some crucial issues in applied linguistics and TESOL.
Thank you once again, Dr. Kei Matsuda, for coming and having
Just
this talk
Matsuda.
with us.
Kei is my middle name.
Okay. And we'd like to start off on a more personal note. And want to ask you, what got you interested in applied linguistics and especially second language writing? And what have you enjoyed the most about teaching L2 writing based on your experience?
Well, I started studying applied linguistics when I was in high school. And I didn't know the term applied linguistics, but I was a terrible student at that time. I hated studying. And my English was not my favorite subject, but there were circumstances that led me to become interested in English, and I had to quickly learn to actually use and write in English. I joined a journalism class where we had to produce English newspaper. But I had zero proficiency. Everybody else was proficient, so I had to catch up. So in order to catch up, I had to figure out how to teach myself English. So I went to the bookstore, started reading lots of books about language acquisition, writing, literacy, and kind of developed a curriculum for myself. So that was my beginning, and then I continued to study applied linguistics on my own while studying journalism and communication and psychology as an undergraduate student. And then, as an undergraduate student, I took a writing class that was taught by a literature professor, and he was a great person, but he didn't know how to teach writing. Well, he did teach me how to use punctuation marks. That was great. But he didn't know how to teach writing, and he didn't especially know how to teach language. And then I began to realize that at the writing center, writing tutors didn't know what to do with international students who had second language related issues and concerns. So I thought, well, somebody has to do something about it. And then I went to graduate school, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to specialize in language because I didn't want to peg myself as an ESL person just because I'm an ESL learner myself, right? But then the issues were just too compelling, and nobody was paying attention to second language writing issues. Language teachers didn't know much about writing at that time, and language teachers didn't know, writing teachers didn't know much about language. So I thought I need to bring these fields together. And then I was looking around and found Tony Silva, who was a specialist in second language writing, one of the early pioneers. And so I went to Purdue to study with him and pursue my PhD in writing and applied linguistics at the same time.
Interesting, thank you. It seems that L2 writing instruction is often tied to correcting ESL students' grammar. So what would you recommend for L2 English writers that are struggling with some of the more notoriously difficult grammar points? such as articles, prepositions, and tense and aspects, things of that nature. What would be your recommendation?
Right. Well, when people ask me, so how do I improve my grammar or how do I improve my English, my general advice, which is similar to what I did when I was in high school, is to use English every day. Right? Corrective feedback does help to some extent, some of the time, but it's not enough. Right? You need lots of exposure to the English language. One of the reasons that non-native English speakers have issues with language is because they haven't had enough exposure and the use of opportunities to use the language. So creating these opportunities is important. And there's a tendency for people to say, okay, I want you to learn to write in academic context, so I'm going to teach you academic writing, right? Well, that too, it is important to learn the conventions and certain aspects of academic writing through these practices. But at the same time, if you don't have the general English proficiency to sustain a special language use, you can't really go very far, right? So my number one suggestion is read every day, read silently and read aloud. And reading aloud actually gave me a really good sense of the rhythm of the English language. And it's much better than rote memorization. So reading in various ways, and then writing every day, and not worrying so much about the grammar at the beginning. And at the beginning is a long time, actually. Right? It takes a long time. And people worry too much about the minor details and not have enough opportunities to practice and have fun with it. Right? So that's really important. And of course, speaking, listening, that's important too. When I was in high school, one of the strategies I used was called shadowing. And that's something that simultaneous interpreters use to train their ears. Right? You listen to someone's speech, and then repeat it exactly the same at the same time. Right? And that helps you develop fluency and accuracy of pronunciation. And over time, you will develop much better second language intuition.
Okay.
And when I explain this to people, I talk about exercising. Right? In order to become a great basketball player, you can't just practice basketball. You need to maintain your good health, and then you exercise, and then build your muscles, build your response, right? And then you work on specialized skills.
Thank you.
So going along with the grammar topic, since we're talking about grammar in writing instruction right now, even though many L2 writing instructors take the role of grammar police, according to Atkinson and Hardy, 2018, written feedback goes beyond treating grammatical errors or form-related errors, right? It expresses feelings, suggests new ways of approaching the topic, conveys agreement or disagreement with ideas, or simply indicates alternative arguments. What are some suggestions you could give to writing instructors for balancing between form structure and also content and meaning on the other hand? And also, how can instructors teach students what to read, look for, and apply in the written feedback they receive from the instructors?
Right. That's a lot of
information.
Well, in general, the most important thing in writing is the overall effectiveness. It's not organization, it's not grammar, it's not even ideas, but if it's not effective overall, then there's a problem. Right? So that's the first thing you look for. And then, if there are problems in achieving that effect, think about what students could be doing in order to make it work. And that's a much more constructive and meaningful way of identifying what kind of feedback you provide than just focusing on the features just because you happen to know about it. Right?
And also, despite their controversies, the traditional 5-paragraph essay templates are still very popular in a range of ESL learning materials and ESL writing courses in middle schools, high schools, university intensive English programs. What are your thoughts on these templates?
Right.
And why do you think that they're still so popular?
Well, the reason that they're popular is because of the tests.
Okay.
And the standardized tests are decontextualized. and they have to be, because it has to be applicable to anybody and everybody, and the readers don't have any knowledge of the students or have prior conversations with these people, right? It's an artificial writing situation, right? It's not a sustained conversation. So, and assessment, frankly, when you're just looking at the text, what you can do is to look at the features, right? So it's much more structural in orientation. And in order to respond to that kind of testing situation, of course, the most effective way to do it is to just memorize the structures, right? The patterns, and then apply it depending on the prompt. And so I think teachers are doing their best to meet their students' needs for test preparation. But test preparation is not teaching language. It's teaching to the test, right? So we need to start teaching the language, writing, the ability to help students develop the ability to interact. And then on the side, help them with the test preparation as well. And we need to persuade the students and parents that it's not enough to prepare for the test, because we get lots of students from all over the world. And one of the problems that I'm seeing, especially from students from China these days, is that they are master test takers. They're really good, right? So their test scores are incredibly high. But in the classroom, many of them can't even communicate or write something that looks like a meaningful act of communication, right? So in order to get over that problem, the teachers, first of all, need to realize that test preparation is just to get their feet in the door, right? Beyond that, they need to prepare for the real challenges of academic writing and professional writing, and also personal writing and other types of writing in general.
Much of your work has explored the issue of voice and identity in writing. What do you think is the L2 writing teacher's role in developing a learner's voice? And are voice and identity something that teachers should explicitly focus on? And if so, how might they do this? And in what kinds of teaching contexts?
Right. This might sound counterintuitive, but teachers should not, the best thing teachers can do is try not to teach voice or insist that students have voice. Because no matter what you do, you can't not have voice. Voice is always there, right? Even if you intend to or not, right? And so rather than trying to, and voice is not a single construct. It's a combination of lots of different features, strategies, choices that students make that affect how the readers interpret the text, right? So it's an interpersonal dimension of writing. It's not just purely structural, it's more interpersonal, right? And trying to teach that directly or trying to assess that in the rubric as a category is not easy, and I don't think it's the best way to do it. But instead, as a reader, when you read student papers, instead of just focusing on the structure and telling them what to do to make it better, tell them how you feel about the text. Does the student come across as an intelligent person? If so, tell them. Does a sentence make the paper sound cynical or mean? Then explain that, right? Talk about the effect before you talk about the features. I think that's the most important thing to do in raising the awareness of voice. But again, voice is not a single skill. Right? It's a combination of lots of factors.
Thank you. So we're going to ask you a few questions about writing assessment, and you sort of dove into it just now. So next we would like to ask you about differences in how certain elements of written discourse are valued in L1 and L2 writing assessment. So, for example, there is a mismatch between L1 writing in the U.S. educational context and EFL or adult ESL settings when it comes to the emphasis on audience awareness. The concept is commonly found in rubric descriptors of ELA and ESL writing assessments in American secondary schools, so the K-12 context, but it is often absent from descriptors of writing rubrics in L2 proficiency examinations, such as TOEFL or IELTS. Moreover, many commercial ESL instruction and writing tasks textbooks are inconsistent in their specification of an intended audience in their instructional writing tasks. So should audience awareness be explicitly included in the criteria for success of L2 writing assessments? What might be some benefits or challenges to including audience awareness in these rubrics?
That's a good question. Let me start from a historical standpoint. Well, first of all, many of the rubrics that are used for second language writers were basically adapted from the analyses and the rubrics of L1 writing. In terms of the categories, and the first one of the most widely used rubrics, the ESL composition profile, was actually developed based on the writing samples that were produced by native English speakers, not by L2 writers, right? And so there's, but when it comes to the assessing second language writing, there is no difference between effective L1 writing and effective L2 writing. What's effective is what's effective, what's not effective is not, right? And within the framework, there are variations and different combination of strengths and weaknesses that you might see in the student population. And in the L1 rubric, traditionally, audience was not included. But then it was added on because people thought paying attention to audience was important. And it is important, right? And so that was a good addition. And it hasn't happened in the L2 context as much, and especially in the standardized testing context, because audience is really hard to measure, right? Again, it's not just a single construct. Sometimes the lack of particular features is evidence of audience awareness, and you can't look for that, right? So in terms of being consistent in assessment, in terms of reliability, audience is a difficult construct to include, and that's, I'm guessing, probably why standardized tests don't like to include complex construct like audience and voice, right? But it's essential. I mean, for transactional writing, not reflective writing, writing that you do for your own benefit. If you don't appeal to the audience, if you don't address the audience appropriately, then the piece of writing can't be effective, right? So there needs to be more emphasis on audience, and not just the audience analyzing who the people are, but thinking about the prior conversations, thinking about the larger context, the discourse community, and looking at a piece of text in that context is important. But one of the reasons that we can't do that effectively in the classroom often is because the writing assignments themselves are often decontextualized. It's just a superficial activity of reproducing certain structures and features rather than an attempt to create something meaningful for an audience.
Okay, thank you. So continuing on the line of assessment, one issue that has been pointed out by L2 writing researchers is that we assess writing very differently from how we teach it. While instruction emphasizes the writing process, most assessments, particularly summative assessments, are cross-sectional, providing snapshots of learner's ability only. Recent technological developments have resulted in new test methods such as scenario-based assessments, which allow for the inclusion of multi-step tasks and standardized assistance. For example, models or feedback. Models of writing are like paragraph or summary writing, or feedback that is given to the students as part of a test. What do you think are the potential benefits of computerized tests for L2 writing assessments? What problems might arise from the current trend of moving towards computer or web-based tests? And do the benefits in terms of authenticity outweigh threats to fairness, for example, being unfair to learners who are not tech savvy or have limited access to technology, which is the case in many EFL contexts?
Right. Well, that's another complex issue. Well, let's see. Well, first of all, computers can't read. They can count features, and then they can guess how people might respond. You know, AI these days are not trying to emulate people's human brain functions, but they are just using probability to figure out what outcomes might be obtained if human readers actually read the piece, right? So it's just a it's not an actually valid assessment of writing, right? It's not because it's not the actual reading and writing process that you're engaging in. So, but it does do a pretty good job of guessing what people might do in most cases, but not all cases. So it can be used as a way of reducing labor and labor costs. And so for cost effectiveness, for the speed, and computers can help human raters. But in the end, if a human rater is not reading it, the computers can be completely wrong and nobody would know, right? Unless students complain. And many of the students don't even complain when they get low scores, and they just have to wonder, so why did I get this score, right? So there are problems with computerized assessment, beyond access, beyond students' ability to use the technology effectively. So there is always a role for human teachers and raters. And another issue is that in the classroom, many people have adapted strategies, assumptions, values that comes from standardized assessment of writing. We used a rubric that looks like the standardized assessment because these are the examples that are given, and there's not much instructions on writing assessment. Right? There's not enough instruction on writing instruction in TESOL programs, frankly. But when it comes to assessment, writing is almost completely missing, except for a superficial discussion of TOEFL, IELTS, and so forth. Right? So there needs to be a lot more emphasis on classroom assessment, and so that's one important point. And another issue is that breaking down a writing task into smaller components and then assessing one by one. Now that sounds like an intuitive thing to do, but that's actually killing the writing, right? It's like you're dissecting a frog, right? And then you're looking at the parts and you're learning about the parts, but the frog is dead, right? And you can't, but writing has to be taken as a whole. And if you want to make it easier, smaller, instead of changing the task, have students engage in realistic writing, but look at only few key features, right? And in writing assessment, there is what's known as primary trait rubric. And primary trait rubric is a kind of analytic rubric, but instead of requiring students to meet all 5 criteria, you can only focus on 1 or 2 most important ones for the particular genre or for the particular teaching purposes or learning purposes. Right? I think that's a much better way of making assessment a little more easier for teachers, and also it's a way of facilitating students' learning by focusing on 1 or 2 learning points rather than overwhelming them with everything.
Setting realistic goals.
Right.
Thank you. And so last question for the assessment strength would be, it relates to previous work by one of our recent graduates. So one of our recent graduates, Dr. Seren O, set out to investigate the possible effects of embedding assistance in writing assessments. To do so, she compared 4 testing conditions, and there were 4 groups of test takers, 3 with access to a linguistic tool, whether it was a dictionary, a thesaurus, or a grammar tool, and like the grammar spell check from a word processor, and 1 without access to any tool, so no assistance. Her study aimed to explore the inclusion of these tools in order to better reflect how L2 learners write in real life. Because usually we make use of any help we can get, right? So, in your opinion, is there room for the inclusion of linguistic tools as part of writing assessments? What aspects should be considered in order to align writing assessment with current writing practices, which include or may include the use of linguistic tools?
That's a good question. It depends on what you're trying to assess. If you're trying to assess students' ability to produce grammatical sentences, then using translation software isn't a good idea, right? But if you are trying to assess students' ability to use the translation software in order to produce something, then having them use the tool makes sense for assessment. And if you are trying to get the sense of the students' overall ability to produce a piece of writing or to communicate through writing, even better, right? Then having them use all the tools that they would normally use is part of the game. But you do need to impose certain restrictions, because if students are using translation software, then they might not be doing a lot of production themselves, right? I mean, using translation software skillfully and appropriately is a kind of skill that they need to learn. And so that can be part of learning. But sometimes you need to exclude that and then have students do other things so you can assess their own production skills, right, and so on. And in real life, students can also ask other people to help, right, editing, right? Or some students even ask people to write their papers for them, right? Now, do you allow that? You wouldn't, right? So there has to be a line. But again, the decisions should be based on what skills or what abilities or competencies or proficiencies you are trying to assess versus. So there's no one size fits all. Right?
Thank you.
Are you, okay.
These were really good ones.
Okay, we'd like to move on and talk about writing and language. And we'd like to focus on the relationship between languages that we speak and our writing. So we'd like to ask you, how much influence, both negative and positive, do you think our native language, our L1, has on our L2 writing? And do you believe that there is an L1 effect, much like kind of what Slobin calls thinking for speaking type of an idea? And do we need to learn how to think for writing in our L2 in order to be effective L2 writers?
The answer depends on the person. Some students rely on their L1, other students don't. Some students inadvertently transfer features from L1, other students do it more strategically. Right? So it really depends on the particular situation. So I don't have an answer, a generic answer for that fits all situations. And in terms of whether students should learn to think and process information in English or not, well, that's part of learning, and it makes it efficient at the advanced level. But there was a study in the, I think it was early 1990s by Hiroi Kobayashi and Carol Wiener. And what they looked at were two groups of students, high intermediate and low intermediate or something like that, right? So two different proficiency levels. And students who had higher proficiency, and they did two tasks. One was direct writing in English, and the other was writing in Japanese and then translating the text into English. And the more advanced students did better when they wrote directly in English. But for students who were developing their language proficiency, lower proficiency group, they did better with the translation skills. Right? And producing writing and communicating is a complex cognitive task. It's more than just producing language. Right? And when students are trying to negotiate language, as they are trying to think about the organization or ideas or how to appeal to the audience, things break down. Right? So instead of trying to do that in a language that you are not familiar with, using all the tools and strategies that you have in your L1 to handle most challenging cognitive tasks and social tasks as well. And then using your ability to translate that into the target language. That seems like a good strategy, right? And that doesn't mean these students don't have to develop their ability to process information in English. That's part of learning, right? But again, there's no clear-cut answers as to whether there should be a transfer or to what extent and how. But it's a matter of the overall effectiveness. Given all the resources you have from your L1 and L2, what can you do in order to produce the desired results?
Interesting. Thank you.
So the age-old issue of whether academic discourse is or should be treated as a second language is still regularly brought up by scholars, writing instructors, tutors, and even graduate teaching assistants. Right, so do you think that all student writers need to acquire academic written discourse as a second or additional language, regardless of their L1 backgrounds?
Mm-hmm. Right. Now that metaphor goes back to Minor Shaughnessy in the 1970s. And she called academic writing students' second language, or everybody's second language. And that has also been applied to second language learners as well. But one thing that many writing teachers have forgotten is that, well, for second language writers, academic writing is their second language, and they are doing that literally in a second language, right? And second language, by second language, I mean any additional language, right? It's a technical term. It doesn't literally mean second language. And so that metaphor can actually mask the complexity of writing in a different language. So that's something that we need to be careful about. And learning to write, whether it's in your L1 or L2, isn't all that different, right? There aren't, you are developing their language proficiency as you develop your academic literacy, right? So I don't think it matters whether we call it a second language or first language. Academic writing is a kind of writing that is not familiar to us from our personal lives. And another distinction that or phenomenon that we need to be aware of is that for non-native English speakers, they have writing proficiency in other domains, right? Because they have had lots of exposure, experience, right? And so they are adding something on top of it. For second language writers, they may have literacy skills in their L1 that can carry over as well, but they don't have a lot of experience in writing in other genres, other situations, right? And again, to use the metaphor of exercising, you need to develop that general skills as you also develop your specialized, more specific purposes skills, right? And I think there's a dichotomy, false dichotomy, between general English and specific purposes English, right? And people tend to think of this as either or, but I think a much better comparison is the general language proficiency and the specialized language proficiency, much like the Bigson CALP that was proposed by Jim Cummings.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so, continuing on the writing and language strand, you have previously highlighted the challenges of considering the implications of world Englishes in the teaching of L2 writing, and have provided some guidelines for teaching both dominant and non-dominant forms and functions, as in your 2010 article. While learners' awareness of dominant forms and functions might be more easily identified in ESL contexts, challenges are found in EFL contexts, given that first, models used in class often represent only the English variety that students are exposed to in the instructional context of the class. There's only one variety in general that they're exposed to. And two, learners are exposed to deviational features, however, through social media and web-based resources, but they may fail to understand the appropriate context of use of these features. So do you have any recommendations on how EFL writing programs and their teachers may embrace world Englishes in their curricula and at the same time set realistic learning goals for their students?
Right. I think this is similar to the general English, specific English situation, right? So language use is always out there, and students are exposed to it. And students may not be aware that there are different situations that call for different uses, right? So being able to point out that they are different without stigmatizing other non-standard or non-dominant uses is important, or to call attention to places where the use of non-dominant language is actually effective, right? So throwing in some of these examples and pointing them out explicitly is an important pedagogical strategy. And what else? I was going to say something, but I forgot.
Yeah, it's always hard to negotiate, right? I mean, growing up, I grew up in an EFL context, and there were things that you would find. I mean, it's changed now, I guess, because of the internet. But you would find something that you never saw in a textbook or in class, and then yeah, so that's pretty close.
And you know, grammar correction and teaching the formal academic English. Now that's important, but if we do it too much too soon, we could actually discourage students from developing a more wholesome ability to use the language, right? More holistic kind of view on how language is used in a wide variety of contexts. So we need to be careful about that. Like let students play with it, and then if something sounds inappropriate, well, we all do that at the beginning, right? When I was a graduate student at the beginning, I may have said something or wrote something that was slightly off, right? And for example, when I organized my first conference, I had 12 keynote speakers. That's awkward.
That's a big conference.
Well, instead of, it was all invited speakers, but it should have been like one keynote speaker and then plenary speakers. Multiple keynote speakers. So that's something that these are conventions that I wasn't fully aware of, right? And that's okay. Nobody gave me a hard time.
Thank you.
And then I learned all the time.
Thank you.
To wrap up, we'd like to ask you a couple of questions regarding recommended practices and the future of the field. So firstly, based on all your experience, what advice would you give to all eager ESL, EFL writing instructors, both novice and veterans, on how to effectively teach writing?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a very broad question.
Right. Okay. So my general answer is, if you're going to teach writing, then you should also write, right? And if you have, I'm a diving instructor, and one of the things that I've learned as a diving instructor is that when you teach a skill, you have to demonstrate it to students. And if you can't demonstrate it, you can't really teach it, and you can't expect students to learn it, right? So we need to produce our own texts. And one of the best things that I've done, and I learned it from a colleague when I was in New Hampshire, is to write along with students. If I create a new assignment, then I would field test it with myself, and then use the examples that I produced and talk about the processes that I went through, and then identify strategies and resources that I needed in order to help students bring those to students' attention, so that they can negotiate the same process. Sometimes we create writing assignments that are unrealistic, too challenging, and then we ask students to perform at a really high level, right? And then we get disappointed, or students get punished for it, right? And that's not fair. So thinking about what's realistic is important, and that sense comes from our own experience and practices, keeping in mind that sometimes we have strengths that other people don't have, or weaknesses that are different from other people.
So finally, one of your ongoing scholarly agendas is to professionalize the landscape of second language writing, creating an identity for the field. Doing so is never an easy task. So what are some of the challenges you have encountered in pursuing this agenda, and how have you addressed them? And what would be like the top priorities for all of us to focus on in this endeavor?
Well, the biggest challenge I encountered at the beginning of the process over 20 years ago was that people didn't recognize second language writing as a thing, right? And so there were people who were studying second language writing, but there wasn't a sense of community, field, infrastructure, identity, right? So creating that identity for the field was the biggest challenge. And many people were trying to talk to writing teachers about language issues, language teachers about writing issues, and people were not interested. And this is still an evolving process. When I go to a new country, sometimes people say, so why are you studying writing? Right? Isn't speaking more important? And then I get to engage in conversations and then raise the awareness. But people do pay attention. There are small groups of people who are interested, and then I bring them together, include them in the conversation, and then I bring my conference to different countries, and then once you bring them together, they meet each other, and then they create a network, and they create a community and a sense of identity, right? So it's an ongoing effort, but creating a narrative, a name that people can recognize. So I use second language writing as a term, and because that's been around and it's handy. And then creating the infrastructure, conferences, and journals, book series, and so on. And also writing the history and the definition, and engaging in that conversation about what it is that we are trying to accomplish. And then including as many people in the conversation as possible is an important challenge.
Thank you.
And that will be the end of the interview. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.